Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with Corey Brooks, and we're going to get into Corey's work, especially around a book you wrote, Corey, in 2016, Liberty, Power, Antislavery Third Parties, and the Transformation of American Politics. Thanks so much for coming on, and I was hoping that you could start off by introducing yourself, Corey, including what led to you writing this book in 2016.
My name's Corey Brooks. I am professor of history at York College of Pennsylvania, where I'm also the chairperson of the Department of History and Political Science. And my book, as you mentioned, Luke, is Liberty Power, about the Liberty and Free Soil parties and the way in which they changed national political debate in the 1840s and 1850s to focus much more so on slavery and on possibilities for anti-slavery politics and anti-slavery policymaking. When I was casting about for an undergraduate senior thesis research topic, I was quite interested in John Quincy Adams's congressional career and the idea of a president returning to Congress and having this sort of second or perhaps third political act to his career. And so I had written a senior thesis about the relationship between Adams and abolitionists, mostly by reading correspondence that Adams had exchanged with prominent abolitionists from the Adams Papers collection at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I saw this developing and intensifying relationship, which I probably could have found in some parts of the secondary scholarly literature, but was certainly new to me as an undergraduate. And pieces of that story that I told in a probably far too lengthy undergraduate thesis project show up in the research that is in parts of my book that look at how abolitionists interacted in the 1830s and 1840s with anti-slavery, with a very relatively small number of anti-slavery congressmen. And so I entered graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, with that sort of research in the back of my mind, and started exploring other parts of the anti-slavery political story, rereading what political abolitionists were saying about certain well-known national debates that touched on the slavery question, like, for example, debates over the Mexican-American War and the Wilmot Proviso, which I suspect we'll discuss later in this interview. And as I dove deeper into this research, I started to see more of a through line in terms of the impact of anti-slavery political organizing and also the impact of some of the political rhetoric and tactics that were pioneered by abolitionists and continued to become more and more efficacious and politically ramifying over the course of the antebellum period.
I was hoping we could start off by setting the scene a little bit. So I was curious, what was the state of the anti-slavery movement in the U.S. before 1840, and particularly if you could touch on what was the slave power, capital S, capital P, according to the abolitionists at this point.
The abolitionist movement, or studies of the abolitionist movement, sometimes look at the 1830s or the beginning of the 1830s as a turning point, during which more radical voices took up a sort of more prominent place in the anti-slavery discourse, with a focus on calls for immediate abolition. This shift is especially famously associated with William Lloyd Garrison's publication of the Boston newspaper, The Liberator, which printed its first issue on New Year's Day of 1831, not unrelated, an American Anti-Slavery Society was organized in 1833, and so there is this sort of growing sense that the responsibility of the abolitionist movement is to agitate and to mobilize Northern public opinion against slavery. And over the course of the 1830s, the abolitionists, people who are really sort of dedicated to this project of radical agitation for immediate abolition of slavery, are certainly a minority of Northerners, probably a relatively small minority of Northerners, but also a growing minority of Northerners. And part of that is a function of the ways in which the arguments that abolitionists are making are compelling. This is in a context in which there is increased religiosity among many white Northerners, as well as people outside of the North, in the series of, or as a result of the series of religious developments known broadly as the Second Great Awakening. And so there are religious arguments that the abolitionists are making that one has a moral religious duty to combat slavery as sin, or as embodying a wide variety of other sins that accompany it. And over the course of the 1830s, there are a series of efforts to tamp down or crush this growing anti-slavery movement that tend to have the reverse effect, right? To make the anti-slavery movement more popular, to attract more potential followers. This includes, right, mob violence directed against abolitionist speakers and publishers in northern cities, including Garrison himself in Boston. It also includes a series of political maneuvers, including by the national government, directed at quieting anti-slavery agitation. One of the most famous is Southern efforts, and ultimately the federal government's complicity in supporting those efforts under President Andrew Jackson, to censor abolitionist mailings that were being sent into the slaveholding states. And then the most politically influential or politically consequential effort to sort of crack down on or silence anti-slavery speech is the infamous gag rule, which is sort of a series of rules that are mostly in effect in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1836 through 1844 to limit or entirely prevent the presentation of anti-slavery petitions. The petition was thought of as a way that anybody could get their voice heard at the national level. And critically, the petition was a mechanism for voicing one's political opinions or political goals that was not limited to voters. So anyone, man, woman, child, right, regardless of race or other status, was thought to be eligible to send this plea to the lawmakers, asking them to consider a particular issue. And so, in the middle of the 1830s, this growing and increasingly organized, but as I said, still small abolitionist movement develops a campaign to send petitions to Congress, asking Congress to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. One place where abolitionists thought, and not all slaveholders agreed with this, but I think most people who were constitutionally knowledgeable agreed, Congress had clear authority to pass laws on any matter, including potentially abolishing slavery at the Capitol. And this was sort of a symbolic, but not meaningless, entering wedge for abolitionist political organizers. What I think few of them would have anticipated is the backlash against this, right? So that Southerners in Congress demand that petitions not be heard, and enough Northern Democrats joined with Southern congressmen to pass this law to pass this rule that said that the House would automatically table these. The response from the abolitionist movement was to petition more, right? And now they found even more signatories who are interested in joining. And I think in the act of signing a petition, right, themselves gain some investment in the cause in the same way that, people who sign online petitions or make political donations or donations to a GoFundMe or something today feel probably more connection to an issue than something they just maybe care about but have never done anything. In the first year after which the abolitionist movement had reorganized its petition campaign and sort of systematized it, I believe the records suggest there were 415,000 signatures on petitions sent to Congress within a year. This becomes, I think, a major part of how abolitionists begin using this language of a slaveholding power, which is later shortened to the pithier slave power, controlling national politics in ways that right, not only support slavery, this immoral institution to which abolitionists are opposed, but also are infringements on sort of basic civil liberties of all Americans, right, including free white Northerners. And so the gagging of anti-slavery speech on the floor of Congress, the censoring of the mails, the mob violence directed at people delivering potentially unpopular speeches or publishing potentially unpopular news materials or pamphlets, right? All of this seems to corroborate the abolitionist argument that the freedom of everybody is threatened by the power of slavery and its supporters. And a big part of, I think, the concept of the slave power is that the number of Americans who were enslavers is a relatively small number. I believe in 1860, something like 1 in 4 Southern white households were slaveholding households, right? But of them, it's only a fraction that are actually these sort of large scale enslavers. The sort of number that has sometimes been used to define who counts as a planter is 20 enslaved people to which somebody claimed ownership. And so that is something like 3% of white Southern households. There were fewer white Southern households by quite a bit than there were white Northern households, right? Not to mention, of course, the sort of 1/6 to 1/8 of all Americans who were enslaved, depending on sort of what date you're looking at to calculate that percentage. So this is a small, but very wealthy and very powerful minority. And that part of the concept of the slave power was that this minority can only sort of achieve their ability to promote and defend slavery and to shut down anti-slavery through the complicity of large numbers of non-slaveholding whites, right, including some significant number of Northerners who either have business interests or political interests in currying favor with Southern enslavers.
What is it that prompts not the entire abolitionist movement, but some sections of the abolitionist movement to start looking at Congress? Is it specifically around the Gag Act? Is it an understanding that this is a way to reach the nation?
Congress is a body that has some actual power over slavery or over aspects of slavery or slavery in certain places, right? And so going back to that 1833 founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society, the declaration that organization published when they founded it included that one of the arenas through which abolitionists would work is the political system to target slavery in the places where constitutionally vulnerable to federal power. So even if most abolitionists sort of accepted the idea that the constitutional framework limited or prevented the ability of the federal government to interfere with slavery in the states where it was legal, there was this sort of litany of of options that the federal government could pursue to target slavery. Restricting slavery on the high seas, abolishing it in the District of Columbia, repealing fugitive slave laws to sort of eliminate the federal government from the process of assisting enslavers in recapturing those who had fled enslavement across state lines, banning slavery in federal territories, refusing to admit new slave states. So there's this series of sort of political options that abolitionists, including Garrison himself, had signed on to in 1833. So it's sort of always there as something in the sort of broad array of tactics that the abolitionist movement could pursue. In the sort of second half of the 1830s, the gag rule certainly directs attention to Congress, and I think calls attention, right, both to sort of the power of enslavers in Congress, but also calls further attention to the idea that, right, Congress could do something about this, and Congress is of course choosing not to. The rumblings of trying to annex Texas, which has just, at least according to Texans, won its independence from Mexico in the mid 1830s as a slaveholding republic that has broken off from a Mexican nation that had abolished slavery, is also sort of in this constellation of issues that are generating congressional attention to anti-slavery politics. And so a growing number of abolitionists over the course of the second half of the 1830s are saying, well, we have to do something about influencing national policymaking and actually state level policymaking too, to the extent that northern state politics had to do with slavery related issues. And so they start by interviewing candidates. Now, once they start interviewing candidates about their views on various slavery related issues, that is actually a potentially big step because they are saying to their supporters that you should, right, let the outcomes of these interviews dictate who you vote for. Right. So if you are a Democrat, but the Whig candidate answers these queries in a favorable way, right, you should vote for the Whig candidate, or vice versa. And that mostly doesn't work. The abolitionists are too small in number, and the candidates either don't answer or give unreliable answers or don't follow through on what they've promised. And so part of that is what leads to ultimately to the founding of a third party. Now, as far as attention to Congress, the other thing that they're seeing, these political abolitionists, by the late 1830s and would continue pursuing once they've formed a third party, is that these debates over the gag rule are generating a lot of national attention. I think not least because John Quincy Adams, this former president, is playing such a prominent role in it, and he is a skillful parliamentarian who sort of creates these opportunities for dragging out these debates and for ridiculing and embarrassing his opponents in these debates. And through this, at least some of abolitionist arguments, and certainly there are arguments about the power and the sort of dictatorial approach of Southern enslavers on the floors of Congress, those are reaching a wide audience. People in the national reading public paid attention to politics. Most newspapers were political in nature. It wasn't uncommon for congressional speeches, or at least summaries of congressional debates, to be front page news in many local papers across the nation. And so abolitionists are starting to realize that if they can work with people like Adams and a series of less well-known anti-slavery congressmen who still are occasionally able to voice these kinds of arguments on the floor of the House, that will disseminate these arguments, including their burgeoning argument about the slave power controlling national political debate, to a much wider audience than those who are attending an abolitionist meeting or reading an abolitionist newspaper.
It's this sort of repeated frustration with what Democrats, what Whig Party members are doing seems to sort of come to a head. I believe it's around who folks vote for as the Speaker of the House at one point, and that leads eventually to the founding of the Liberty Party in 1840. And so I was curious what the Liberty Party wanted to accomplish. Was it really embodying this idea of a third party that could win majority power and legislate out of slavery? And I was also curious who the target audience was. Were they looking to talk to everyone? Were they looking to target a specific section of U.S. society at that time?
The Liberty Party is founded in part out of a frustration with abolitionists' inability to influence politics by working through the major parties or working with major party politicians. And it's perhaps notable that by around 1840 is when the second party system, which had been sort of developing over the course of Andrew Jackson's presidency, this division between the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whigs, right, has really come to sort of full flowering, right? So they're facing an incredibly robust two-party system where most voters, because of course the majority of Americans are not voters at this time, but most voters, uh, pretty much all white men in most places, and black men in about maybe 5 states or so. But most voters are identified with one or the other parties. They have party affiliation. Turnout is very high in this period. I think in the 1840 election, um, scholars calculate that turnout is maybe like 80%. And again, this is among people who are eligible to vote, of course. So, what abolitionists are seeing, or what some abolitionists are seeing, is that as both parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, are trying to build a winning coalition to win national power, both parties are sort of inevitably dependent on cross-sectional support, on winning support from Northern voters and Southern voters. And for most Southern voters, slavery is a priority, is the priority, right? And sort of any challenge to slavery is basically unbroachable for the vast majority of Southern politicians and presumably for most of their voters. And that means that in a national election, slavery is mostly off the table. And this is also true, as you alluded to, not just in a presidential election, but in organizing Congress, right, in choosing the Speaker of the House, which was quite consequential because the Speaker dictated the committee appointments, which shaped what legislation could possibly make it to the floor of Congress, and that is, I suppose, roughly true today. Although sort of the process of who was on what committee and how many seats the minority party got and so forth was much less formulaic back then. The idea of creating a third party is probably always dependent on some degree of like irrational optimism. Um, right there, there's something radical and visionary going on here, where probably some of these people are imagining, right, this transformation, achieving this transformation where the Liberty Party could one day, right, be winning national elections. I don't think they're delusional though, right? So in the 1840 election, the Liberty Party showing is pitiful. I think they get over 1% of the vote in only Massachusetts. Of course, they're also not in it for sort of short-term one election, right? They have the sense that they will continue to build on this movement, and to the extent that we're just measuring their impact by counting votes, right? Their numbers increase, although right still they are a quite small portion of the northern electorate. I think they get about 2.3% of the national popular vote in the 1844 presidential election. but I think their hope is that they can sort of contribute to a strategic repositioning of debates in national politics, right? To force people to talk about slavery, and perhaps especially so in closely divided constituencies, of which there were many, or closely divided northern constituencies, of which there were many. A small minority could potentially wield a balance of power. In terms of who they're trying to influence, it's potentially anybody, any northern voter, and actually I shouldn't just say northern voters because they're also trying to win the support of white women in the North, both because of their impact on public opinion, and also I think some hope because of their potential to impact the voting choices of the men in their lives. Basically anybody. And so one of the sort of core ideas of the Liberty Party, core tactical ideas, is what they call the one idea principle, which is that the party should be focused on the one idea of opposition to slavery. I mean, that could include a series of specific political goals, abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia, or perhaps related goals like um, repealing restrictions on black voting in the states where African Americans were unable to cast a ballot, but in particular, trying to studiously avoid weighing in on the other sorts of issues that most commonly divided the Whig and Democratic parties, which in this time, I mean, there were several, but among the most prominent were debates about what banking policy should look like, debates about what tariff policy should look like, and debates over sort of the extent to which the federal government should be involved in, and sometimes state governments too, in infrastructure projects or what people at the time called internal improvements. And so by trying to avoid taking a side on those issues, political abolitionists believe they'd have a better chance to win support from former Whigs or former Democrats. In other words, what united them had to be their opposition to slavery and a contention, right, that this opposition to slavery and opposition to slave power was more important than all of these other uh, comparatively trivial issues.
One thing that's occurring to me as you're talking is how much part of the struggle is just to get this conversation out into the open. It's not as if there are these raging debates and these folks are really focused on honing their arguments to defeat their opponents in pitched battles on the floor about the significance of slavery or whether it's just or so on and so forth. It's more so, it sounds like, just trying to bring it out, and then the opposition trying to silence it, trying to avoid it. It sort of made me think at various points. I was talking with David Waldstreicher about his book on the Constitution and slavery within the Constitution, and how you have a document that, in Waldstreicher's opinion, supports slavery but does it in a way that doesn't say the word. So it flows through the sort of, we know it's there, but we're not going to talk about it. But it's increasingly becoming impossible not to talk about. And then everything that the pro slavery folks do to try and tamp down seems to sort of come back and bite them in the foot a little bit. So I was reminded of that dynamic just as you were speaking.
Yeah, and so I mean, we could say over the sort of long run, it looks like the most sort of extreme pro-slavery voices were counterproductive to achieving their long-term aims. Right, anti-slavery grew and ultimately became more politically powerful. But I think there's a variety of sort of reasons why the radicals on the pro-slavery side behaved in the way they did. I mean, certainly there is this sort of scholarship on the culture of honor that talks about how many Southern enslavers sort of subscribed to cultural ideas where being publicly criticized was sort of an outrageous shaming that couldn't be sort of tolerated lightly. There was such an immense economic investment in enslaved people as property assets, whose market value fluctuated like other assets, that there was, and here I'm thinking of scholarship by scholars like James Houston, or before him an economist named Gavin Wright, that sort of this mindfulness of threats to not even abolish slavery entirely, but to reduce the value of the slave economy would have been motivating for some enslavers. But I think that there are some Southerners for whom what you described as this sort of quiet acceptance of slavery is in and of itself really not going far enough, right? And so this is famously associated with the phrase "the positive good," and with South Carolina Senator John Calhoun, this idea that really the government should actually be on record as being sort of fully pro-slavery. So some of these people are pushing back at any anti-slavery criticism as intolerable, and in some ways, the two sides are actually feeding off of each other, right? And in terms of sort of shorter-term political gains or movement building, right? Like the two extremes, if you will, the people who are insisting on a outright vociferous defense of slavery, and the abolitionists are benefiting from continuing this dialogue that the, I think, sort of mainstream political establishment would probably rather avoid as unnecessarily disruptive.
There are these events that really bring things to a head. So one of them is the Wilmot Proviso, which was a proposed bill subsequently killed in the Senate that would have prohibited slavery in territory taken during the Mexican-American War, because that's a big thing. Suddenly the size of the U.S. at least doubles, and now you have new territory. Is it going to be free, slave land, so on and so forth? One of those things is the birth of the Free Soil Party. So I was curious if you could talk about the Wilmot Proviso and what comes out of that, because that's a big part of this story, it seems.
This moment in 1846, where David Wilmot sort of adds this rider onto an appropriations bill, is a big potential turning point. So the war with Mexico is some months old, but Congress is about to go out of session, and there is this sort of quirk in the 19th century legislative calendar that I think probably drives a lot of consequential political decision making, that for a lot of the year Congress didn't meet. So typically, and there was not a standardized congressional election date either. So people would be elected at different times from different districts. Now our elections take place in November of even numbered years. So typically elections would take place maybe sometime from like the summer of the even numbered year into the beginning of the winter of the odd numbered year. And then the new Congress would sit starting in December of the odd numbered year. The lame duck Congress would still be in session through March of that odd numbered year, and then they'd go out of session. And so, unless the president called Congress in for an emergency, there would be in odd numbered years essentially a 9-month hiatus. Now, in even numbered years, the Congress that had started its first session in December of the odd numbered year, right? So in this case, started in December of 1845 and is meeting through 1846. They can decide when they're going to adjourn. And so usually that went into the summer, but that still means you've got the whole fall where there's no Congress, and there's really no way to bring Congress back unless the president calls Congress back, or unless Congress had already made that plan before they adjourned. Otherwise, they're not coming back to D.C. until December. So the bill that is proposed is to give President Polk millions of dollars to be used in negotiating for peace with Mexico while Congress is out of session. And so questions are raised as to why would you need money to negotiate for peace? Well, you would need money to negotiate for peace if you're planning to buy land as part of the peace deal. And Polk had pitched this war somewhat dubiously based on the idea that Mexico had attacked the American army on American territory. I say dubiously because the American army had sort of moved into territory that Texas claimed, but was probably more accurately part of Mexico. And Polk had actually already been looking for reasons to go to war with Mexico because he wanted to seize Mexican land, including, I think, especially the warm weather Pacific coastal ports of California. So this bill seemed to corroborate charges that opponents of Polk's war, and especially anti-slavery opponents of Polk's war, were making that this was really a war of conquest, and that it was a war aimed at conquering more territory for Southern slavery, which may or may not have actually been Polk's priority. But nevertheless, this seemed to confirm what the critics were saying, and so Northern Democrats don't want to go home to their constituents and tell them that they're fighting this war to expand slavery. And so a relatively obscure and previously pretty solidly pro-administration Democrat from northern Pennsylvania named David Wilmot adds this rider, and it gets his name because he's the one who gets the floor, but there are a whole group of these northern Democrats who are sort of hatching this kind of plan and would have done similarly if they had the opportunity to attach this rider. And this is like the last, or I think maybe the second to last day of the congressional session. And then what is sort of surprising here is that all the votes on the war up to this point had been pretty partisan. Democrats North and South supporting what the Polk administration wanted, Whigs North and South being more likely to oppose it. Once the Wilmot Proviso is attached, those partisan lines almost totally melt away, and we start seeing a sectional pattern of voting for arguably the first time in sort of the history of the second party system of Whigs and Democrats. So just about every Northerner, Whig or Democrat, votes for the proviso, and maybe more tellingly, once the proviso is attached, because there are, in fact, a majority of Northerners in the House of Representatives, vote also for this appropriation, right? So the Whigs, too, are voting to give Polk this money to acquire, presumably to be used to acquire territory that they have been highly critical of, once they're getting this sort of pledge that there'll be no slavery in this territory as part of the bill. And likewise, Southern Democrats, who have been reliable supporters of giving the Polk administration what it needs to wage the war, are outright opposed to obviously the proviso, but also the appropriation. The bill stalls in the Senate because in the Senate there is a roughly even division between Southern slaveholders and representatives of non-slaveholding states, and that pattern repeats really sort of over and over again over the next couple of congressional sessions. So the second session of the Congress that meets in sort of late 1846 through March of 1847, and then again in the next Congress that comes in December of 1847 is meeting into 1848, at least until the treaty ending the Mexican-American War sort of makes the Wilmot Proviso itself a moot point, right? The territory's been acquired now. So you can't attach conditions to acquiring the territory. Although then there are, of course, more debates over the territory, and particularly over whether slavery will be allowed or prohibited in California, which leads to years of wrangling that results in the controversial set of measures known as the Compromise of 1850. Now, over the course of this process, political abolitionists in the Liberty Party are seeing growing numbers of Whigs and Democrats on the floor of Congress articulating the exact kinds of anti-slave power arguments that you would previously only find being made by Liberty Party activists and maybe a very, very small number of the most radically anti-slavery Whig congressmen. Now these are sort of mainstream political arguments, at least when the debate is about the Wilmot Proviso and about the question of slavery and lands to be acquired from Mexico. They don't go to the sort of full logical conclusion yet that, well, this means the Whig and the Democratic parties are complicit in supporting slavery, right? Because they're still Whigs and Democrats. But the rest of it, Southern slaveholders wield too much power, that it is, potentially not constitutionally allowable and certainly morally dubious to expand slavery into places where it's already been prohibited, right? Which was the case under Mexican law. And the national discourse around slavery sounds very different when we enter the 1848 political season than it had 2 years earlier. And a number of political abolitionists see an opportunity to capitalize on this. Probably the most significant of them, or the most influential, though certainly not the only, is Salmon Chase, a Liberty Party activist at this point in Cincinnati, Ohio. And Chase would famously go on to be an incredibly influential Republican politician in the Civil War era, a senator, a governor, secretary of Treasury, and then ultimately Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And he sees this sort of moment to build a broader anti-slave power coalition, right? That this is sort of the first best chance to really unmoor thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands or more Whigs and Democrats from their party allegiances. And so he starts preparing the groundwork. He starts conversing with some of the most prominent anti-slavery voices within the Northern Whig Party, as well as this sort of group of disaffected Democrats, disaffected from their national party and from President Polk, organized around former President Martin Van Buren. And their anti-slavery commitments are certainly more questionable, though as a group, these are people who have vocally supported the Wilmot Proviso and have become highly critical of sort of mainstream Democratic Party leaders. Chase and others like him see this moment to bring everybody together, particularly when both the Democratic and the Whig national presidential nominating conventions nominate candidates that would be obviously unacceptable to anti-slavery voters, a sort of anti-proviso Michigan Democrat, former Secretary of War named Lewis Cass, and the slaveholding Whig candidate Zachary Taylor, a Mexican war hero and Louisiana plantation owner. And so the Liberty Party activists who are sort of most interested in creating this bigger coalition, if you will, this big tent coalition. I use that phrase because they held a meeting in Buffalo to organize the coalition where there was no building big enough in Buffalo to bring everybody together. And so they actually had like a gigantic tent that people met under while Chase and some of the other sort of bigwigs were doing the backroom negotiations to cement this new party. But Chase has been sort of laying the groundwork so that when the Whig and Democratic parties fail to nominate somebody acceptable to anti-slavery voters, which Chase and his allies pretty much know is going to happen, they spring into action, call together this new convention, and create this party called the Free Soil Party. And there's a series of sort of complex negotiations, right? The Liberty Party has, in some ways, the most organized, motivated core, but probably the smallest number of voters compared to the so-called conscience Whigs or the New York sort of Van Burenite Democrats. And so because of their largest numbers, the Van Buren Democrats basically get to make Van Buren the first presidential candidate of the Free Soil Party. But Chase and former Liberty partisans seem to be most interested in writing the platform. And in particular, they want to broaden the platform sort of as far as they can in an anti-slavery direction without turning off their more conservative partners. And What they particularly want is they don't want the platform to be only about the Wilmot Proviso or only about slavery in the territories. Right? They want to write in language about the federal government and the slave power. And the language which Chase has been using for years at this point for the Liberty Party and is now importing into the Free Soil Party is that the platform of the Free Soil Party is in favor of divorcing the federal government from slavery. In other words, that the federal government should have no responsibility for slavery. And so anywhere that the federal government has jurisdiction, it should take the anti-slavery side, right? So abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia, banning slavery in the territories, which is the issue that is occasioning this new coalition. But in sort of diplomacy, in prohibiting the use of enslaved people at federal forts and other installations in the South, right? Certainly on the fugitive slave issue, there's a number of ways that that abolitionists have been arguing that the federal government needs to sort of get out of the business of supporting or even tolerating slavery.
Can you talk a little bit more about those collaborations between free soilers and sympathetic Whigs and Democrats? For example, a collaboration like that helped get Charles Sumner elected to the Senate in 1851, and Sumner is, of course, a very central figure. What positions were and weren't negotiable within those collaborations? Was there concern that the anti-slavery aspect would get lost in the need to do some sort of real politicking? Was there discussion around that? How do we retain our values at the same time that we're working with other folks?
Yeah, that is, I think, a frequent source of debate and sort of hand wringing. As I would say, as Liberty partisans worked with members of the major parties, and then subsequently, right, as the sort of larger and more moderate Free Soil Party again sort of found itself occasionally in situations where there was debate about to what extent do we work with one or the other of the major parties. In general, I think the sort of main point that can't be compromised on for members of the Liberty Party and Free Soilers with these anti-slavery backgrounds, right, is sort of broadly this opposition to the slave power. The Compromise of 1850 measures are passed, right? That also means sort of resistance to and calls for repeal of the unpopular and fairly draconian Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Now, one of the ways there is this means for collaboration, including that which sends Charles Sumner to the Senate in 1851 and actually sends Salmon Chase to the Senate in 1849, is the extent to which Free Soilers concerned most about the slavery issue are prioritizing power at the national level, which in 21st century America might seem obvious that people would prioritize power at the national level, but in the 19th century, control of state government was often very important. Right, a lot of policy making happened at the state level and not at the federal level in the antebellum era, and so often there are these sort of moments of opportunity, including those that result in Chase's and Sumner's elections to the Senate, where Free Soilers are able to wield a balance of power between the two major parties and collaborate with one of those major parties by giving them power at the state level in exchange for their supporting placing Free Soilers in positions of national influence. And the Senate election is particularly sort of interesting and particularly important opportunity for third parties because the Senate election in most state legislatures required a majority, right? So, in case any listeners are unfamiliar with this, during this time period, right until several years into the 20th century, senators were elected by state legislatures, not by the voters of a state. I don't want to say for sure in all, but I believe, perhaps in all, and certainly in most state legislatures, the process for electing a United States senator required an absolute majority, not a plurality. You needed a candidate that could have more than half the votes of the legislature, which meant that when a third party could wield a balance of power in the legislature, um, they had real power to dictate the choice of senator. Now, it's also the case that within legislatures, right, and this is true today, and this might be more familiar to people who followed the seeming, although I'd say relatively short-lived chaos of the last Kevin McCarthy Speaker election, that within legislatures, and this is true at the state and at the national level, um, it usually takes a majority to organize the legislature, to choose a speaker, a majority leader, right, to dictate which party is going to have control over committee leadership, and uh, and that is very desirable because both at the congressional level and at the state level, right, those majority parties usually set the agenda for what legislation can get considered, for what legislation will make it to the floor, for what people will vote on. And certainly we've seen debates about and controversies about in our own Congress um, today what can get a vote and what can't even come up for a vote. And so in Sumner's case, um, the Whigs were sort of the clear plurality party. The Whigs really dominated Massachusetts for much of the antebellum period, but the Democrats and the Free Soilers combined um, had a clear majority of the seats in the Massachusetts legislature. At points, in fact, the Free Soilers even outpolled the Democrats, though that wasn't consistent. There were times where the Democrats were the second party and the Free Soilers were the third. But regardless, the Free Soilers had the potential to trade power at the state level for power at the national level. Now, in the case of Massachusetts, the situation was even more unique because in New England or in most of the New England states, election to just about any office required a majority of votes cast. And so with three parties somewhat evenly divided, um, the state couldn't even elect a governor or elect congressmen in many congressional districts. And this is a sort of set of rules that New England third party political abolitionists have been exploiting for some years by the time we get to the 1850s. But in the case of 1851, so what the Free Soilers have to trade is not just control of the legislature, but also control of or the ability to select the governor of the state for the next year. Free Soilers make this trade, and it is controversial. There are some people that don't trust the Democrats, and they're fairly justified in doing so because it takes a large number of secret ballots before enough votes come together to actually send Sumner to the Senate. Sort of quirk that the Free Soilers had to organize the legislature first before they could then proceed to vote for senator. But right, Sumner, this arguably the most consequential radical anti-slavery voice in national politics over the course of the Civil War era, right? His political career or his national political career is really a product of this conscious choice to trade state level power in the North for the ability to put somebody on the floor of the Senate who can articulate these anti-slavery views, right? And that is, I think, of a piece with abolitionist experiences going back to the 1830s of how valuable it was to have people in Congress who would be willing to or able to articulate anti-slavery and anti-slave power arguments, right? That this is a mechanism for changing national debate and for reaching Northern voters who aren't yet supporters, at least politically, of the anti-slavery movement.
To move us quickly through a lot of history, you have then the Republican Party founded in 1854. And just thinking about that, rather remarkable that you have these three new parties appear on the scene in just this 14-year span. Perhaps it speaks to just how, I don't know, volatile that period particularly was. The Republican Party comes on in 1854. A lot of these folks who we're talking about come aboard. This is Lincoln's party. Sumner comes aboard. Stevens comes aboard. Lincoln wins in 60. The South succeeds. Two questions, I guess, and actually they're a little distinct. So I'll start with one. Is there this sense that the Republican Party is a culmination of this process? Certainly, it might be easy for us today to look at it like that because it is the Republican Party that engages in the Civil War, and these other two parties have since gone to the wind. Is there a sense, though, at the time that, okay, here in 54, we've sort of found our party, our voice in politics?
Yeah, I think it is broadly right to consider the Republican Party a culmination of this process. And the way that I see it, and the way that I think some of the most prominent political abolitionists were seeing it, is that the Liberty Party was founded in 1840 because the two major parties were deemed to be so thoroughly complicit in supporting slavery that you couldn't even hope to do any sort of meaningful anti-slavery policymaking working with these parties, right? So you needed a new party structure, right? And the criticism of these parties and the way in which the slave power was a partisan argument was about the sort of structural problem of having parties that were dependent on slaveholding support. And so what the Republican Party offered was a party organized around the slavery issue. Now, admittedly, a more moderate version of the slavery issue, where sort of the one idea unifying everybody is opposition to slavery in the territories, and maybe even more narrowly, opposition to slavery in Kansas. But nevertheless, you have a party organized around the slavery issue that is large enough, or has the potential to be large enough, to not depend on the support of slaveholders, right? And to become one of the two major parties, right? So this uh, this offers the sort of structural reorganizing of national politics that many anti-slavery politicians had been pining for, right? And so when the Whig Party was starting to look weak in the early 1850s, political abolitionists, people like Chase and Sumner, were talking about in their correspondence the sort of promise of one of the major parties collapsing, right? Like if one of the major parties collapsed, then we could reorganize national politics, not around these more trivial issues of political economy, trivial at least in their view, but around this most critical issue of slavery and the slave power, right? That it was the party system, the old party system of Whigs and Democrats, that had prevented that. And so the Republican Party offers this moment of promise. Now, it's not instantaneous that the Republican Party is obviously the new major party, right? There is this incredible strength in parts of the North and a few parts of the South for the so-called American Party, or Know Nothing, sort of anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic party that seeks to maybe organize politics not around slavery, but around what some scholars have called these ethnocultural divisions. And so where my book kind of ends, not counting the epilogue, and what I see as really sort of the moment that cements the success of a lot of this political abolitionist political vision, at least, is the 1856 speaker election. Now, normally speakers of the House were elected in odd-numbered years, but it took months to elect the Speaker of the House in 1856, and this is the Kevin McCarthy saga pales in comparison. 133 ballots, 2 months. Basically, all the House was doing was just balloting to elect a speaker, or debating over how they should ballot to elect a speaker. And people come up with all these crazy ideas to sort of speed things along. Like, well, what if we turn out the fires in the fireplace so that will speed everybody up? Or like, what if we just start drawing names out of a hat? And of course, none of these things are able to get support of the majority of voters. But you had a situation where a plurality in the Congress were Republicans, but many of them were also affiliated with the Know Nothing movement, and then there were some Know Nothings who were pro-slavery or conservative and wanted nothing to do with with the Republicans, and then there were also, of course, Democrats who were broadly pro-slavery, certainly supportive of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and so over the course of these sort of months of politicking, a coalition is forged that really decides that they're going to stick to this one candidate, a Massachusetts Republican named Nathaniel Banks, who had sort of some ties to the Know Nothing movement, but was definitely clearly identified as a Republican by this time. And eventually, he is elected on a plurality vote. Right? They through complicated machinations that one could read a little bit more about in my book if they were interested. They convince a majority of Congress to vote to accept a plurality winner, and then Banks wins that plurality. But when he does, that is almost like a launching point for the Republican presidential campaign of 1856. And even though the Republicans don't win in 1856, they're very clearly established as the other major party in national politics, and they actually win plurality of northern votes in that election. And it's an election that is clearly hinging, in large part, around questions related to slavery and slavery in the territories. And so that is a major shift, despite the ways in which the Republican Party is much more moderate than the Liberty Party was. That is a major shift in terms of the place of slavery and anti-slavery, as sort of at the center now of national politics.
What becomes of some of these characters who you focus on in the 40s and in the 50s? What are they engaging in during the Civil War, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction? Are there particular things that stand out to you about where they go?
Yeah, I mean, of course, with a large movement of a lot of people, there's a series of individual stories, and certainly uh, some of the early progenitors of abolitionist politics are distanced from sort of the center of the organized anti-slavery politics as the movement becomes a more mainstream and inherently sort of more moderate, large-scale political coalition. And there are some who are deceased, of course, by the time we get to the Civil War. But there are a number of sort of key players within the Republican Party, and often they're some of the sort of key players pitching relatively more radical policies who have backgrounds in the Free Soil Party and some even in the Liberty Party. Right. So Salmon Chase, I already mentioned, is probably the most prominent example, and he is sort of seen as the most radically anti-slavery voice within Lincoln's cabinet. Charles Sumner, who is somebody who absolutely has Lincoln's ear on certain issues, is the most prominent anti-slavery radical in the United States Senate until his death in the mid 1870s. Owen Lovejoy, who we haven't talked about at all yet, was a Northern Illinois abolitionist and Liberty Party activist. He makes his way into Congress as a Republican, and I believe he passes away before the conclusion of the Civil War. But during the Civil War, he is one of the most vocal advocates for pushing abolition policy, making emancipation federal policy, before in the years before it becomes federal policy, uh, fulfilling other components of the sort of old divorcing the federal government from slavery program, like banning slavery from the District of Columbia, banning slavery from the territories, admitting new free states, and those sorts of goals, repealing the fugitive slave law. And somebody else that's perhaps worth noting. He also really enters the story as a free soiler. Is George Washington Julian of Indiana? George Julian was the Free Soil vice presidential candidate in 1852. He served a term as a Free Soil congressman, right? One of approximately a dozen Free Soil congressmen in the 1848 to 1850 congressional session. And he's back in Congress during the Civil War and into the Reconstruction period. And he is arguably the most sort of vocal, Thaddeus Stevens as well, I suppose, but arguably sort of the most vocal proponent of federal land redistribution programs, promoting the goal of essentially confiscating and dispersing the plantation lands of Confederate enslavers to support the creation of homesteads for freed people on the lands that they had made valuable through their decades of toil. So certainly within the wartime and post-war Republican Party, there are a number of more radical voices who can draw connections back to the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party. Now, they had to have been obviously relatively older in the Civil War era and relatively younger in their 1840s activism to sort of bridge that whole period. But the people who sort of fit that bill are very important in pushing, unfortunately, often unsuccessfully, for more radical visions of what a post-slavery society will look like.
To turn to this question of having a third party. It's notoriously difficult to create a third party in winner take all electoral systems in general, of which the US happens to be, and easier in countries with proportional representation. You made the point about how, well, in such a system, it creates a certain power, if you will, if there is a third party. But just the creation of that third party is also immensely difficult. What allowed for the formation of new parties in the antebellum period, and do you see some connection with the same difficulties that we see today?
Yeah, I mean, certainly some of the difficulties that we see today are right, sort of this profound identification with political parties. Although I think a lot more people today probably see themselves as politically independent. But I think also right, this fear of wasting your vote is quite significant in a winner take all system. And certainly some of the successes that anti-slavery third parties had was because of their identification and exploitation of moments where a third party could wield a balance of power because elections required a majority. And I suppose that would be true today as well in similar circumstances within legislatures. Of course, that requires a third party to be influential enough in enough constituencies to actually elect a balance of power in a legislature, which right now seems less likely to be the case. There are real impediments today with this sort of fear of wasting one's vote, this justifiable fear of wasting one's vote. And I think some of what motivated the early adopters of anti-slavery third party politics and convinced them not to fear wasting their vote was, of course, a moral conviction that it would be morally unacceptable to support either of the major parties, right? And it also, I think, required identifying sort of an axis, an issue or set of issues that you could plausibly, convincingly say that sort of both parties were, if not equally complicit with, at least similarly complicit with. And they did face, third party abolitionists did face this criticism of, if you don't vote for the sort of moderately anti-slavery Whigs, or what political abolitionists might have seen as the moderately pro-slavery Whigs versus the more outwardly pro-slavery Democrats, right? You're electing these greater of evils, right? That there is this sort of and ultimately, I think the abolitionists were able to be convincing to enough people to make a difference, or to at least wield balances of power, that the two parties were really so functionally similar on this one issue that was the most important issue. And so, I mean, that probably wouldn't be a source of promise or optimism for people seeking to organize a third party today, in that it might be harder to identify what is this issue that you can plausibly say is the most important issue in national politics that both parties are sort of equally complicit in, and that a third party, if it rose to power, could really change. I mean, maybe you or some of your listeners have ideas of what that issue is, but in terms of wielding a balance of power, it's perhaps hard to see that right now. Uh, but maybe not. One never knows how sort of political opinions and events will change. I think that there are institutional ways that things could open up for greater third party influence, and so a number of sort of lawyer activists that I've talked to are really interested in restoring what's called fusion balloting or cross nomination or cross endorsement, and actually wrote a law review article, I guess about a year ago, in the St. John's Law Review, or co-wrote, that looked at sort of historical antecedents to this, where more commonly with the Free Soil and the Republican parties than with the Liberty Party, there would be these sort of tacit agreements to nominate the same candidate, so that people could vote a Free Soil ticket or vote a Whig ticket while still voting for sort of a shared candidate for a particular office. And the modern advocates of ballot fusion feel like this would give uh, third parties more ability to build allegiance, right? Because people would vote for the third party in the same way that signing an anti-slavery petition built a connection, without necessarily feeling like they were throwing their vote away on a particular race, and also give, of course, the third party some sort of negotiating chips. All right, if you want us to cross endorse your candidates, that he would appear or she would appear as both the, let's say hypothetically, the Green Party candidate and the Democratic Party candidate on this ballot in this state, right? Have to write your platform in a way or nominate a candidate in a way that would be appealing to us. And so there is some sort of uh, antecedent for that. I broadly think it's ridiculous that states ban this process, and that the arguments for doing so are mostly not in good faith. The history of most of the bans of this cross nomination date to like systematic efforts of late 19th century state legislatures to weaken third parties, or sometimes early 20th century. But I also don't think that is going to be some tremendous fix all. Ranked choice voting probably has some similar appeal in making it possible to demonstrate support for a third party and build a third party constituency without the sort of fear of people throwing their vote away in the early stages when the third party has no actual chance of winning. I'm not as optimistic about the short to medium term future of third party politics as the political abolitionists who founded the Liberty Party were in 1840.
The last thing I want to ask you before we say goodbye, perhaps anyone who has an issue that they think is very important and doesn't see either of the two major parties talking about would be very interested in a book talking about the creation of third parties that talk about a very important issue, which is, broadly speaking, what interests me about the history that you discuss. And the blog is called the Democratic Constitution blog, the podcast, the Democratic Constitution podcast. So for me, that's the issue that neither of these two political parties that we have are talking about. You answered this question a little bit in terms of having a topic that attracts people, but I'm curious if there are other lessons that people seeking to make, it could be anything, I suppose, a national issue. In this case, in my opinion, the undemocratic character of the Constitution, a national political issue. What can be drawn from that? Obviously, having a lot of people, a lot of good orators, a lot of good writers helped by events that throw things into the national spotlight, and then they're reacting to those things. But curious if you had any other thoughts about that.
Well, certainly the political abolitionists drew on a tradition that think is still very prevalent in American political discourse of identifying sort of sources of unfair or unequal power in our society, in our political system. Right, like there is certainly a story where the abolitionist movement is able to win more political support by suggesting that, right, the issue they care about affects the average person, right? So that, slavery and slaveholders' political power, right, is not just a problem because of the immoral treatment of Southern African Americans, but, right, it's also a problem for you, white Northern voter, because of the way that it's trampling on your civil liberties and your rights, right, and that there's sort of a fundamental unfairness and, because I presume you would be interested in undemocraticness of this small wealthy group wielding so much power because they're willing to push other people around to get what they want, and sort of nobody is willing to stand up to them, or few people are willing to stand up to them. And those kinds of rhetorical appeals to, I think, fairness, to sort of basic principles of, everybody should have an equal vote and equal access. Like, I think those have consistently held some level of appeal over the course of American political history, and it's sort of then, the ability to make those appeals convincing. And there is this challenge that the abolitionists encountered of, to the extent that you can uh, work within the system in the spaces that it actually allows for sort of infiltrating the system, right? That is a big way to get your ideas out. Of course, there's the sort of challenge of uh, how do you work within or perhaps exploit openings in the system while still remaining a critic of the system.
Yeah, those are very important questions to consider, and I think the history that you present here is uh, not necessarily a perfect guide, just in the sense that one can't ever necessarily just read history and then apply it exactly, but a very interesting and a very inspiring moment in which people were struggling and grappling with how to make the country a better place.
I'd like to think it has some relevance in that way.
Corey, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. Really encourage folks to check out your book, which again is Liberty Power, Antislavery Third Parties, and the Transformation of American Politics. And before we started recording, you mentioned you're getting into other work around Reconstruction and other aspects of U.S. history. It'd be great to perhaps have you on at some other point to talk about further work that you're doing.
I would look forward to that. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me about my book. I enjoyed the conversation.